Hello and welcome to this presentation on fostering healthy relationships with peers, pragmatics in action. I am Dr. Amy Sarkowski, and I'm excited to share this topic with you today. Pragmatics is something I'm quite passionate about, and I hope that you will be too by the end of today's presentation. When we think about the deaf and hard of hearing children that we support, I think we often have a shared goal or vision of them having positive relationships with their peers, of them being happy, of them navigating the world in positive ways. Pragmatics, I believe, is an important aspect of that. In fact, I've done some work in the area with colleagues internationally, and collectively we have put together a supplement on pragmatics in children who are deaf or hard of hearing. And we really think that it is a bit of the next frontier in terms of the kinds of support that we should be providing to children who are deaf or hard of hearing. With early identification of reduced hearing and early implementation of various supports, including sign language if that's what the child and family are inclined to do, or use of hearing technologies, we are seeing children who are deaf and hard of hearing having positive language outcomes, which is fantastic. One of the areas where we do see a bit of a lag in some cases is in this area of pragmatics. I'll be talking and more about what that means and defining the term for you, but also just helping us to think about pragmatics as being something that we can continue to strive toward improving as a whole. What is pragmatics? It isn't as easy to define as it should be for a single word. In part, this is because pragmatics is studied across a variety of disciplines, and they define it differently. People who are in linguistics talk about pragmatics in a very specific way. People who are in speech language and communication sciences and disorders talk about it in a specific way. Psychologists talk about it in a different way. This is a visual from a group of authors who did a systematic review of pragmatics, and they looked at across the board of published works in pragmatics, what are the associated terms that kind of come up. And there are a lot of things here. There are things like semantics, which is a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of the language components. There are things like requests being an important aspect of when one is utilizing pragmatic skills. How do you make requests in ways that can be acceptable to peers? So pragmatics, we're going to sort of have a shared assumption about what it means for the purpose of this presentation. Here, what we're talking about is sensitivity to one's communication partner. That can include a variety of things, like pausing, giving more time when it is clear that that communication partner needs the time, or making sure that we are responding in ways that are really contingent on what that other person said. So they ask a question and we respond with something very specific to the question, not something that's off target, for example. Pragmatics is also looking at comprehending and producing contextual information and language in social contexts. In fact, some people describe pragmatics as social use of language, and that is an abbreviated, shortened way of kind of thinking about it. But I want us to broaden our understanding so that we're not thinking of pragmatics as language alone, and I'll give you more examples as we continue. Pragmatics also is using the communicative abilities that a person has to understand and relate with others. Here's where I think it is beyond language alone, because a lot of what is conveyed in terms of pragmatic understanding might be done with an eyebrow or with a particular gesture or other nonverbal aspects and other ways of letting people know, like, I hear you, I'm following you, I understand what you're talking about. So language can be an important part of it. And pragmatics is also separate from language per se. Language development and early pragmatics, they do play off of each other. However, there are examples in which there are children who have reduced language. Maybe they were identified with reduced hearing a little bit later. Maybe they're catching up in their language abilities, and yet they have strong pragmatics. Using whatever limited repertoire of language they have, they actually are able to convey a lot with people. Maybe they're really good at pointing and getting someone's attention and drawing their attention to a shared referent. I want to talk with you about this thing. Or they might point to it and indicate, I need to know more. So they're using their pragmatic skills in ways that could even exceed what their language abilities are. We also see children who are deaf or hard of hearing who score well on standardized language assessments. So they seem that they're doing really well. They're on target. And yet their ability to apply that language in social contexts, maybe they're struggling with that a little bit. That, in fact, is one of the things that piqued my interest in this area, was being introduced to children whose language was on par for their age, and yet the ways in which they were using it were interesting. They were different. And it made me think, oh, there's got to be something more about this, which led me down the path to wanting to know more about pragmatics and collaborating with peers from a variety of disciplines who were also interested in the same topic. Pragmatic development in early language, also thinking about language learning occurring within an inferential, pragmatic context. Inferential, meaning we make inferences. There are a lot of things in communication that are not necessarily spoken or signed. They're not communicated directly, but they're understood. Certainly that can be informed by cultural understanding, but also there are other aspects of this is how we interact in this particular setting. And helping children who are deaf or hard of hearing to understand those nuances and the ways in which one setting might be different than another setting can be really important. It might be the polite thing to do for a child to be able to very nicely ask to be included in a game. And perhaps in a speech language therapy session, that might be what they're actually focusing on, is learning the vocabulary to do that. But pragmatics would suggest that if all of the other children who are playing the game are acting in a certain way, the child might be able to say, I want to play. And that might not be the polite way of saying, please include me. But it might be the way that is more actually acceptable for their peers of that age. So it is a little bit less about using language that is necessarily sophisticated and rather using language and other things, communication abilities and nonverbals and other ways to get one's needs known and understood at a level that would be expected with that child's peers. We've made the analogy that we swim in pragmatics. So rather than language being thought of as, first you have some auditory access or you have visual access and you're building blocks and putting it together to make words and then phrases and sentences, and then you reach this level of pragmatic understanding. Maybe instead, pragmatics is actually the water that we're swimming in all of the time. The expectations for how we are even going to use the language that we gain, or recognizing that very young children are using pragmatics much before they're actually getting to a formal language system. So if we think of pragmatics in that way, then it behooves all of us to think about how do we formulate environments where pragmatics is being considered and people are striving to understand how we can foster that for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. If pragmatics is the idea that you can connect with other people using your language and communication and whatever other abilities you have in order to get your needs known, to understand others, and to build on a relationship, there's a lot that we can do collectively as professionals who support children who are deaf or hard of hearing in order to help them to reach those goals. I'm not going to delve into all of the aspects of pragmatics, but there are a few that I want to highlight today. Communicative intent. So, one of the things that can be really important as we're working with children who are deaf or hard of hearing and are growing their language abilities is to honor their communicative intent. For sure, there are times when we might want to correct a child's speech or provide feedback on their hand movements if they're using sign, or provide other feedback that will allow them to better their language-related abilities. However, most of the time when that happens, it's best done in the therapy, in the speech language therapy or the communication therapy where they're focused on building those skills. When a child excitedly is trying to tell you a story and they've, made a little mistake with a word, or their signing is backward, or they've done something, but they're conveying something, we want to really honor the intent of their message. That's important. Pragmatics really looks also at the communicative intent of things that are not spoken and not articulated, right? The ways in which we might roll our eyes to indicate disapproval, and possibilities where something might not be literal. I could say, for example, to a child, I promise you don't want to push my buttons. We don't mean promise like the pinky promise, right? It's not really a promise of something going forward. It might be a little bit more of a threat. That could be an example of using terminology, using a phrase in a non literal way that might need to be more expressively and explicitly taught to children who are deaf or hard of hearing. For children with reduced hearing, some of these nuances can be a little bit trickier to pick up. So, for the professionals working with this population and working to support these children, we can be mindful of, oh, that might be something that might not on the surface make immediate sense. So, let's provide some more explanation around it. Let's make sure that we're giving opportunities for understanding that what is said is not always meant. Figurative language is another example where children who are deaf or hard of hearing may experience vulnerabilities in this area. Metaphor, irony, idioms are all examples of we say something and it isn't actually what we mean. A very common one that you hear if you're of a certain age is it's raining cats and dogs. And in this slide, you'll see a picture of a book by that name. We don't actually envision cats and dogs falling from the sky. That can be confusing. What do you mean by that? If you're a child who's deaf or hard of hearing and you haven't yet had access to those kinds of phrases, um, what does that mean? It can make one doubt oneself. Maybe I heard that wrong, or maybe those signs weren't right. Maybe it just doesn't make sense to me. Helping children to understand that we often in our culture use words that mean something different than they sound like we're trying to say, or we're using something that has some historical meaning that doesn't on the surface have meaning at this moment. Those are examples of pragmatics that children who are deaf or hard of hearing might benefit from having exposure to and explicit instruction. So, the importance of pragmatics. Pragmatic skills, including that ability to use language in social contexts and in relation with others, has been shown to have really important impacts. It helps us to understand shared meaning, which helps us to connect with others, and it's critical for development, learning, and well being. If children who are deaf or hard of hearing are making strong gains in lots of aspects of language, and this is an area where we haven't, as a field, provided a whole lot of emphasis quite yet. Thinking about the ways that when a child is learning to use their communicative abilities with friends and peers and in social circumstances, we are really helping to empower them to navigate their worlds. For children who are deaf or hard of hearing, why is pragmatics particularly important? It shapes social cognitive development. We learn language not only to learn language. We don't learn language for language's sake. Language is important, and people who are in our field working with deaf and hard of hearing children largely recognize that language is vital. I believe that we really need to also be thinking about language for the purpose of it helping us to understand our world. The language that we own and that we really can master helps us to understand our world better. We use language internally in our self-talk to help us solve problems, to help us figure things out, to help us navigate and make decisions. There's so many ways that we use the language that we have. And those aspects of helping children to utilize that language in order to further their peer relationships, I think serves a really vital purpose for all of us. I understand that some children who are deaf or hard of hearing may arrive in our classrooms and our therapy rooms without having a robust, solid language foundation. And so it can feel like we need to do exposure, get as much language in as possible. And certainly it's important to have children have exposure to language that is accessible to them. Yet we have decisions to make in terms of the kind of language that we are exposing children to. And perhaps a language list of vocabulary words of everyday household items might be less powerful than words that help them to convey their inner thoughts and the things that they want to with their peers. If we spend our language learning time thinking about how do we help utilize the communication abilities to further those peer relationships and the ability to connect with others, I think we'll get more bang for our buck. And it might not necessarily be that we spend significantly more time working on language abilities, but rather that we are being selective and mindful and saying, when we really focus on building language that helps children to navigate their social relationships with peers, we get a lot more from it and it becomes much more meaningful for the child. Another reason that pragmatics is important in children who are deaf or hard of hearing. It's been identified by some scholars as a missing link in social interactions. Work by Goberis and colleagues, and also by Christy Yoshinagi Itano et al., have really described pragmatics in this way, as being this missing link. Even when children have shown solid or strong language-related, communication-related abilities, and when those are compared with pragmatic abilities, there often have been gaps. There is more research that needs to be done in this area for us to have a robust understanding of this. But early indicators certainly point to the need for filling in this missing gap. Skills mastered by children with typical hearing by early ages. So studies that have looked at children with typical hearing at 5, 6, and 7 years of age show that they master a number of these pragmatic abilities. So nearly all of the children are doing all of these things by the time they are entering or ending the kindergarten years. In contrast, children who are deaf or hard of hearing show delays in being able to master those same abilities. So at age 5, for example, children who have typical hearing are mastering a significant portion in the 90%, and perhaps around 50% or so of children who are deaf or hard of hearing are performing at that same level. Children who are deaf or hard of hearing do often catch up with these abilities. So maybe by the time they're 7, they're showing, by and large, the ability to demonstrate a lot of these pragmatics. Delays, though, are really important. If we think about the ways in which having delays in one's ability to communicate and to connect with peers, once a child has entered kindergarten and doesn't yet have those solid abilities in those pragmatics, and they're still developing them into second, maybe third grade, they are behind their peers in the terms of being able to utilize pragmatics and understand pragmatics, which has implications for how they are embraced by peers and how they navigate that those social circumstances rather. So I'd like us for just a minute to ponder the implications of those peer relationships. What happens for children that we adore and support who are deaf or hard of hearing, who are entering school age and not having these pragmatic abilities? Another reason I think that it's quite important for us to think about and prioritize pragmatics is that individuals who are themselves deaf or hard of hearing have shared with us that looking back, one of the things that they really recognize as being a vulnerability for them is this pragmatic ability. Not all of them used that term or necessarily even knew of it or framed it in that way. But when studies have been done that have looked at and people who are deaf or hard of hearing have been brought to the table to discuss what is it like? What's your experience with pragmatics? By and large, there is an overwhelming consensus that, gosh, this is an area of vulnerability. So even amongst deaf and hard of hearing adults who are highly successful, extremely well accomplished in the world, they look back and report, I wish I had known more about pragmatics earlier on. This is referencing a paper that includes those voices. Included among the authorial team are individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing themselves, as well as parents and caregivers of children who are deaf or hard of hearing, reflecting on their experiences with their children. This is freely available and the link is included if you're interested. So, one successful deaf and hard of hearing adult reports mishaps tend to be more nuanced. We share common experiences of that feeling of simultaneously understanding and not quite understanding, of not quite getting it, or becoming aware only after an interaction that something may have been important that was missed. We understood the content of particular communications, yet somehow we missed its intent and meaning. This is another quote from that same paper. It was very important to me that I not appear, quote unquote, stupid. So I would often fake it in situations. I wish I was taught some coping strategies early on. This would have gone a long way in helping to develop real relationships. When you're spending a lot of energy trying to look like you fit in, you really do not fit in and have close relationships, friends, and relationships. I hope that collectively this has helped make the case for why I'm hoping that you and all of us can move forward in thinking more about pragmatics. Development of pragmatics starts early. So let's take a moment and consider your understanding of pragmatics. Where were you in thinking about pragmatics before these last few minutes? And what are some gaps that you might want to make sure that we cover going forward? Let's just take a minute and ponder that. Okay. Having given it some thought, let's talk a little bit more about how pragmatics develops in those early years. By 12 months of age, within that first year, children learn a range of communicative intentions through their gestures and vocalizations. They learn, and anyone who's ever cared for a child learns that they have different cries for different purposes, that when a child is hurt versus when they're hungry versus when they need comforting, the ways in which they communicate that to us differ. And they learn that when they are producing a gesture, a vocalization, an emotion, they are getting something in response. So they learn about that early turn taking. They learn that they have a little bit of agency in moving the connection forward with their caregivers. By 2 years of age, 24 months, children are requesting information. They might be doing that with words or signs, with gestures, with pointing and shrugging, with drawing your attention to something and getting you to give them information. They might be using some of those same strategies in asking questions, or they might be asking why. They also are acknowledging different partners and they adjust their communication in order to communicate with people who differ in their own communication styles. A very common example is that if they have two caregivers, maybe they recognize that one caregiver communicates in a very expressive way and another caregiver in a different way. Or that one caregiver uses one language and another caregiver uses another. They may learn that the way that they communicate with their parents differs from the way that they communicate with somebody who takes care of them in a preschool setting or daycare. Children are then adjusting how they interact and their expectations for social interactions based on those different communication partners. By 3 years of age, children are asking please. They're utilizing the cultural normative examples of politeness in some ways. They may not always do it independently. They might need to be prompted, and yet they still will do it when prompted and they understand the purpose behind it. Children who are 3 years of age also tell stories. Now, these stories might not be extravagant, they might not always be in order, but there is some sense of something happened and then something else happened. There was an initial event and then there was a consequence. Children might point to something and say, and indicate that it dropped and then make a face, uh-oh. Or they may be more verbose in their use of whatever language they use in order to communicate. Something dropped off the table and it broke and it was scary, or mom was surprised. They will be also sussing out whether their communication partners are interested in the conversation. I think without delving into the literature around this, there's, been a little bit around how when parents and caregivers are distracted by using cell phones, for example, and not engaging, those really are missed opportunities for the child to note that I'm communicating something and the person caring for me is responding and is interested. So those are things that are happening very early on in typical development, as well as for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. By being mindful and aware of the various ways in which this development is taking place, we can help to intervene when necessary, and we can be mindful and note it and let children know we notice that you're doing this. We see, for example, that you're asking questions, and I'm going to be respectful and honor that by responding to you. Even if it's the fifth question in a row, I'm still going to give you some information to try to quelch your need for more knowledge. Early in the parent or caregiver and child relationship, we see different relational factors that also lay the foundation for pragmatic development. One of them is synchronicity. We think of this very often as the calming of the child, right? So if a child is upset and the caregiver calms them, we see them being sort of in tune. But there are different ways in which that can happen as well. And studies are also showing that babies' brains are also syncing up with that of their caregivers, so that when caregivers are stressed or overwhelmed, babies can pick up on that, and also they have heightened responses in their own bodies. When there is syncing, there is this idea of when I have a reaction or I respond in some way, the baby is responding too, right? So there is this turn taking, there's a give and take, and there's a sense of we are connected. Caregiver responsiveness to the baby is another important factor. How attentive they are, how much joint attention they use. So if I'm wanting to engage a baby, I'm not just only looking at the baby, I'm also looking at the thing that I'm talking about, or I'm pointing to the birds as I'm saying, yeah, you heard that? You have a new cochlear implant and you just got it turned on and I can see you responding. I can provide you information about that. So those are just some examples in which we might use the visual attention, the joint attention in order to build that connectedness and also to foster pragmatics. Early theory of mind starts to happen in this very early time period of life where babies start to note, oh, because my caregiver is distracted or because they are really intent in looking at me right now, that I'm getting something different from them. Being able to say, I have some sense of their perspective and that we are also trying to do the same for the child. Play is really great for this. And children, even young babies, a year, 2 years of age, they really are showing us through play sort of their understanding. It helps them to make sense of their world. Mind-mindedness. This is the idea that a parent or caregiver can talk about what they believe is happening for the child, giving language and helping to understand that. So the child is having some tears. And the caregiver says, I think you might be upset because you wanted that toy and your little sister took that toy. Um, Giving language to that, even if it's not, if you might not always be right, but you can both model what your internal states are and talking about what's happening for you and talk about what you think might be going on for the child, and that can help them to then understand that you're paying attention to what is going on for them and starting to give language to that. And again, when I mention language, it can be any form of language that the caregivers are using to give that input and receive information from the child. I mentioned children telling stories, and there's just almost nothing more delightful than a 3-year-old telling a story. Sometimes they get excited and they jump to the end and they forgot the middle, and it's quite cute. But that early storytelling helps us to understand turn taking because they're also waiting for you to respond. They're going to give you some information about the story. You're going to respond. They're going to continue on. And it helps them with that sequencing too. Engaging in turn taking is a very important aspect of pragmatics. And even amongst adults who have pragmatic challenges, appropriate turn taking, giving time and space, and knowing when it's my turn can be a challenge too. So we don't expect perfection amongst young children doing this task. But remember that if children who have typical hearing are doing most of these things, most of the time, by the time they are entering elementary school, we want to have expectations that are on par for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. We really don't want to say, well, for a child who's deaf or hard of hearing, they're doing okay. We need to raise the bar so that we all have expectations that children who are deaf or hard of hearing are getting the right supports early on so that they really can enter that formalized school with those same skills up to their cognitive potential and up to whatever it is that they individually are capable of doing. All right. I'm going to ask you to consider a scenario. I'm going to talk this through and then we'll take a pause and have you fill it out and then we'll come back. But here we go. So consider in your life, amongst the deaf and hard of hearing children that you support, when have pragmatics been an issue? Jot down a couple of examples. What comes to mind? So if you have a little bit more understanding about what are pragmatics, and then you can reflect on, what are some times that was an issue? The second question, did pragmatics ever get mislabeled or misunderstood? The third, think of that one kid, because we all have the one kid who maybe struggled in this area. And if you have that person in mind, we can then refer back to that child as we talk a little bit more about ways that you can support them going forward. So I'm going to pause now and have you fill out those questions. Welcome back. I wish we had the opportunity to do this in person. I really enjoy the audience participation piece, but I hope that you did take the time to consider these and reflect on these questions. So, when have pragmatics been an issue? I wonder if you see more of it in the context of free play with children, or maybe it's on the playground, or maybe it's when a particular child is with a group of peers who are familiar to them. Maybe they're with their cousins or something like that. When do you see those opportunities? The second question was about pragmatics getting mislabeled. I think that this happens probably too much. When a child is not sure how to take turns, they might be labeled as bossy. When a child is thought to not be able to manage in a social circumstance, they might be thought to have inattention. People might be quick to move to that and say, they don't care. And that might not be the case. It might be an area of vulnerability in pragmatics that we're talking about instead. And then finally, thinking of that one kid as you continue forward. Hopefully, as we have some more discussion about ways to support it, you can also generate in your own mind thoughts about how would we move that forward for this child that you're working with? How can we help them to build their skills? Development of pragmatics continues as children grow. So far, I've talked about young children. I've talked about infancy and toddlerhood and getting ready to head into school. But these skills continue as children grow. They are relational. We move from parents and caregivers being the primary motivators of pragmatic development to lots of kinds of relationships. Peer relationships, relationships with teachers, relationships that deaf and hard of hearing children have with you. All of these are potential possibilities for fostering pragmatic development. Sometimes we think of pragmatics as being in the dyad, and most of the examples I've given thus far have been that the caregiver and the child are interacting in some way. They also can be greater in context. It could be that an entire group of kids who are enrolled in communication therapy under your guise, or that your classroom is a cultural context in which relational conversations and communication and pragmatics are happening. So it can happen in these various different ways. Pragmatics is important for learning. Learning, for many of us, we're in the business of helping children who are deaf or hard of hearing to learn. What are some important aspects of that? Well, researchers who look at pragmatics talk about joint attention being quite important for learning. And we talked about that a little bit ago, that idea of having a shared referent, having something that we can both look to and understand, and then have our different perspectives on. Social contexts. This is the ground in which social pragmatics is growing, right? Common ground. Hmm. This is something for us to think about. Are we providing opportunities for children who are deaf or hard of hearing to have similar experiences to their peers? I remember distinctly an example when I was part of a clinical team where there was a family talking about a movie that was quite popular with elementary school age children at the time, and them being hesitant about having their child who's deaf go and watch the movie, thinking that the child wouldn't get it. But then having some really interesting conversations about everyone in this class is going to be talking about this movie. If our child doesn't have that experience, they're going to be missing out in different ways. They might miss out at the movie and not understand all of the context. So, how can we make that better? This one particular family decided to watch the movie 3 times. They watched it initially, and then they had some just great discussions and follow-up, and then they watched it a second time, and then they really paid attention to the pragmatics. What was the child understanding and not yet understanding about what was happening with the characters, about the ways in which they were building relationships? So this was a commitment on the part of this particular family to watch this movie 3 times in order to ensure that when the child went to the classroom and everyone was talking about the movie, there was common ground. There was a common experience. And the child, according to the teacher report, was really able to engage in ways that the child hadn't done prior to that when they were having these group times and discussion. Sometimes it does require extra effort on the part of families and caregivers, on the part of all of us who are supporting children. But I think that the idea of valuing those shared experiences is also really important. We might think it's just a movie, not a big deal. But if you're the child who is the only child who hasn't seen the movie, it can feel really quite isolating. To the extent that we can provide children who are deaf or hard of hearing opportunities to be with peers in experiencing opportunities for building common ground, we can really be serving them well. Implicature, inferencing also. How do we help help children to understand that what is said is not always what is meant? What is implied is not always said. Right? I might say to my child, that ice cream is just going to melt if it's left in the car after the grocery store. I'm not just stating a fact. I'm implying maybe you should help carry in the groceries. There are lots of ways that we use these implicatures throughout our day, and helping children to understand, what they meant was, can be a really good service for them too, and important to building pragmatic understanding. So, thinking about pragmatic considerations, perhaps we are thinking about children who are deaf and have additional disabilities or are deaf disabled. We might have to think a little bit differently about communicative intent. So, a child who uses sign language and has cerebral palsy, we might need to be broad in our understanding of the way that something is communicated. A child who is deaf and has a disability may have difficulties with initiating a conversation. Sometimes some prompts might be useful in that kind of circumstance. Some children who are deaf with disabilities utilize an AAC, or alternative augmentative communication device. In that case, it can be important for those who are supporting the child to have some understanding about how that particular device works, how the strategies that are needed to get to the page or the buttons or the icons that the child needs in order to convey what it is that they really want. There are a lot of demands, cognitive demands, on using an AAC device that people who are unfamiliar with it might not be aware. Yet, building into those devices, if you're the speech language person who might be programming an AAC, for example, being able to have a button that asks someone to repeat, that can help to repair a conversation, that can say, "Excuse me, but I wonder if you could say that again. Those are all very powerful ways of helping children who have perhaps additional challenges to also continue to foster their pragmatic development too. We tend to focus a lot on language. And I recognize the importance of that. And as I've said before, we don't only use language for the purpose of language, but we also use it really for connectedness. We use language to build our relationships with others. So I hope that we are using the time and energy that we have to support children's language development in incorporating those social pieces because it can also help to build healthy relationships. Now, I'm going to ask you to design a pragmatic lesson plan. Here's what would be useful. Depending on your particular role, think about I'm a classroom teacher, or I'm itinerant teacher, or I'm providing support through communication therapy, or whatever the case might be. How do you engage in social building and pragmatic development with the deaf and hard of hearing children that you support? How could you do that with intention? Some people are marvelous at this. They're just really good and they do it quite naturally. But I'd like to take some time to have you develop a plan that you could implement as part of your lesson plan for infusing pragmatic development. And then when we come back after this break, then we'll have a chance to think a little bit more deeply about additional strategies for doing that. So take 5 minutes, enjoy the time to ponder, see what you can get down on paper, and we'll go from there. Welcome back. I hope that you have in front of you your lesson plan sketched out, ideas that you have for supporting your class or the students that you follow, or maybe it's that one particular kid that we asked you to think of who has some pragmatic challenges that you would really like to see improve and move forward on that child's abilities. So, what are some thoughts? These are some examples of potential strategies for building pragmatics in a lesson plan. The first is giving directions. When you're giving directions, it's important that you have shared reference. So, a child who might be telling another child how to make cookies would need to know what are chocolate chips. A child who's giving directions might also say, well, to get from our school to the library, first you have to turn left and then you go to the post office. And at the post office, you turn right. That's a shared referent. That's the idea that we both have some understanding of something, we can reference it, and then we can build our directions from there. Another activity could be making something. A child who is explaining to another child how to make something would need to include different steps for sequencing, what needs to happen first and second and third, and also have some understanding for what is known by the other person. An example here could be if I'm teaching another child how to draw a sunset, I can probably assume that if they're in school, they have some knowledge of what are crayons. So I can just use that terminology, the crayon, and they know what I'm talking about. If I'm doing something like needlepoint and I'm talking with a peer about that, they might not have that same knowledge. I might need to give more background knowledge or background information in order for it to make sense to them. And part of pragmatics is the ability to know when that is necessary. Learning how to play a game is another example. If I'm trying to teach a child how to play a game, I want to be able to describe it, all of the parts of it, but I also might want to make sense by saying the point of the game. So going kind of to the end and saying the point of the game is explaining that, and then going back and talking about how you get there. That will help your listener, your communication partner, to understand what this will involve. For example, if I were using the game Sorry, I might indicate that the point is to go from the start to get all of my pawns or game pieces into the safety zone. And then I could describe all of the steps that are needed to get there and the rules that govern the play. Playing 20 questions is another opportunity that you could utilize for building these pragmatic abilities. This also requires understood knowledge and reading into others' responses. For example, if I'm playing 20 questions, I'm trying to get at figuring out what the other person is thinking about. And I say animal, and they say yes. And I say, does it have legs? And they go, uh, and they indicate maybe they're counting. Is it 2 legs? Is it 4 legs? I can read into those nonverbal cues and say, oh, I'm not going to then have my next guess be something that is tangential or not related, right? So being able to understand, oh, I think I'm getting close based on the clues that the other person is giving me. Recognizing a falsehood. Sometimes parents and caregivers are quite surprised that one of the pragmatic abilities that we expect for children is that they are able to lie. Now, as a parent myself, I know that when my child lies, I am not usually happy about it. But the ability to lie, to know when maybe I would get in trouble if I tell the truth, or to know that I do know what my mom bought my brother for his birthday, but probably I don't want to say that. Those are actually pragmatic skills. So we do want children to be able to identify true and false, to be able to know when there's a falsehood that they can later interrogate, learn more about it, and actually to lie are all pragmatic abilities. Finally, responding to an interrupter might be another thing to do. Maybe you are having children in your therapy group or in your classroom act something out and you have a plant. So one child has been told to interrupt a lot. How the other children then respond to that can be a lesson in pragmatics. When someone in a group is trying to take over a conversation, what are some strategies that you might have to help address that kind of a challenge in a social circumstance? So, those are some thoughts that you can then reflect on from the lesson that you created and see if there are any things that you might take from this going forward as you work with children who are deaf or hard of hearing who you're trying to support. All right, we're going to dive in a little bit more with pragmatic development. These are areas that have been identified as infrastructure for communication. Pro-social motivation. I'm going to talk about some of these a little bit more as we go through. Social cognitive abilities. This is the understanding of others, the ability to know whether they had some intent, the ability to have empathy for others. Engaging in shared intentionality. This again is this idea we talked about reference, but also I'm trying to do something. I'm trying to move a chair through a door and it doesn't quite fit. So I don't have to say anything, but my peer who has good pragmatic abilities can know, oh, if you push the door a little bit further, it can help. Or maybe my friend has the suggestion that we turn it on its side and it can get through the door that way. So here's some examples of utilizing pragmatics and ways in which that lays that foundation for thinking about communication. Contingent action sequences, which we've described previously as turn taking, right? You and me. And then also like, it's your turn. It's not my turn, so I'm going to wait. But also I'm going to give you the space. And I'm not going to just be thinking and preparing my own responses. I'm actually going to wait and listen through eyes, ears, whatever way I can get information so that I know what it is you're trying to convey and that my response is related to what you're saying. Pragmatics are associated with formal language, as we described before, with social cognition, the ability to understand what are the social demands of a circumstance or situation, as well as executive functioning. We in this field, people who work with children broadly, have some understanding that executive functioning, the ability to control oneself, the ability to inhibit responses, to initiate responses, tends to come online a little bit later, right? So we continue to develop our executive functioning skills through adolescence and into early adulthood. We don't expect children who are 3 to have mastered these kinds of skills, but we do know that children who are 13 and who are 23 are better and better able to inhibit their responses when they need to in order to adjust to the social demands, and then to be able to honor their communication partners. All of these are important in pragmatics. We can help children to grow these skills by also helping them to understand the processes. So in addition to modeling that when you talk or communicate something to me, I wait. I might check out and see if I got it right. I might ask a clarifying question if I'm not quite sure I got it right, and then I can respond. The more that we model that, but we can also label that process. And when we do that, then we can help children to be in tune with how it is that they are helping to regulate and monitor themselves. Pro-social motivation was mentioned as an important part of early communication, part of the foundation. So, what is pro-social motivation? Well, this is the desire to engage, the desire to help, the desire to be connected with other people. In order to have true communication, it really is helpful if both partners want to have that communication, if they both want to move it forward. Factors that can facilitate include emotional empathy. When children have understanding of others' emotions and are able to empathize with that, they can imagine themselves perhaps in the other person's situation. That can help to foster this pro-social motivation. Studies also show that when we're part of an in group, so when I belong, I feel like I'm part of this cohort who's in my class. Or I might be alone in the mainstream, but I have a group of deaf and hard of hearing children that I get together with every month when we go to a particular activity, and they really support me. I have an in group. When I feel like I'm a part of an in group, I am more inclined to be kind, and I'm more inclined to show this pro-social behavior. Some children have higher levels of altruism, and studies just suggest that that can be true, and that also influences the level of kindness that we see. Now, this pro-social motivation is an important aspect for peer relationships. I think it's too common where we say to a class of children, we say, okay, friends, or we sort of assume that everyone should be friends. Actually, it's a really good skill to be able to decipher those who you should keep at a distance, who might be less trustworthy, who might be unkind where you know it, but maybe your teacher hasn't been able to see it as overtly. So the assumption that everyone be friends with everyone else doesn't necessarily serve us well in terms of being able to figure out who are true friends and how do we develop true friendships, particularly for children who are deaf or hard of hearing and maybe at risk for missing some of the nuances that happen in those social circumstances. But going back to the factors that help. When modeling behaviors that are helpful, that can be another strategy for helping children to develop those skills. Also, the joy of helping. I am somebody who really appreciates joy, and I was thrilled to see in the literature the emphasis on the joy of helping. We can help children to recognize that when a peer needs help and they're able to help, it not only is helpful to the peer, but also helps them to feel good about themselves. It can help a child to feel like they are contributing. It can help them to feel like more of the in group, whereas they may not have been as much of the in group prior to that. In contrast to the factors that facilitate, there are also factors that hinder the sense of pro-social motivation. One of them is social exclusion. We need to be mindful that some children who are deaf or hard of hearing are not as welcomed with their peers who have typical hearing, and that's an important factor. It's also true that children who are deaf with disabilities may be less welcomed in their peer group of children who are deaf or hard of hearing who do not have additional disabilities. We can't necessarily assume that children, because they're deaf, will be friends with another child because they're deaf. And at the same time, knowing that when we find people who are part of an in-group who have shared background experience, that can be a factor that contributes to positive peer relations. So creating those opportunities for children who are deaf or hard of hearing to interact with other children who are deaf or hard of hearing is a very good thing, but creating the expectation that any particular child who's deaf or hard of hearing will be friends with another child who is deaf or hard of hearing is not as helpful for either child involved. Being part of the outgroup tends to be a factor that makes someone not want to help. When you've not been treated well by your peers, you're not eager to engage in helping them out when necessary. Anonymity is another thing that can lead us to not take action or to not be as kind. It's true for all of us. It's true for us as adults too. When our name and face is on it, then we are more likely to act in ways that are kind. When people won't know who we are, if we don't do something, we are less likely to do the right thing or to do the kind thing. So if that's true for us, for all of us, that's just something to be mindful of in terms of this pro-social behavior and motivation. Lack of models is another one. We can serve our population of students who are deaf with disabilities or deaf and hard of hearing by being models and having them see us think through the process of how can we be most helpful? When is it good to help? And when do we need to protect ourselves or create some boundaries? It isn't up to you to address the situation if there's a bully in the playground. That really should be an adult, as an example. But there are other circumstances too where children who are deaf or hard of hearing may feel compelled to take actions when they aren't necessarily as well equipped to do that. And so we can help to support them to build those skills. I like this visual because I like the idea of thinking of pragmatics as being part of the minds meeting and not only the communication. So if you just do a search for pragmatics, often you'll see something like a speech bubble, right? So I say this and this person says that, and that's thought of as communication. But pragmatics really meaning I'm having greater understanding of your intent, what you're thinking, what your knowledge is about a circumstance or a situation, and then I'm responding in kind. So it is this bigger picture of interacting sort of brain to brain or with more of our whole selves. Again, if we go back to that idea that you can have strong pragmatics even in the absence of really strong language skills, that perhaps that those are less overlapping and a little bit more, they are related, and yet we can grow pragmatics and we can grow language, and that's not exactly the same process. For children who are deaf or hard of hearing, sometimes we can think about various ways that pragmatic plays out when children are getting a little bit older. So, some examples as children move into the later childhood years and into adolescence, things like deceit are important. We talked about the ability to lie. Deceit can also be, something like I'm supposed to be home at 11 o'clock. That's my curfew. And I was a couple minutes late. So I set the clock back. That could be not a language based lie, but it could be deceitful. Sarcasm is actually a really important aspect of pragmatics. Sometimes you can look at a family and you say, wow, I can't believe that dad just said that to that kid. And then you hear the kid say something really sarcastic back and you think, oh, that's apparently how they roll, right? In that family context, that's how people communicate. Sarcasm, sometimes, again, parents and caregivers don't always love it, but it's a really important ability as children move into adolescence and as they are trying to navigate social relationships with peers. Adolescents use a lot of sarcasm, and that can be knowing what it means and knowing when to take offense or not take offense can be a really important skill, particularly for children who are deaf or hard of hearing and may not have auditory access to all the nuances, the auditory information that gets conveyed with sarcasm. If they perceive it as a slight, then a child who's deaf or hard of hearing may respond in a way that, that takes the joke out of it. And then they're at risk at being perceived as taking things too seriously and not being included. Non-literal language. I can date myself using some examples from when I was young, or we can try to use an example from modern day. So people might say, oh, that's fat. And they don't mean fat. They mean, it's cool. Or they might say cap, and that has a different meaning too. Non-literal language can also mean something like I ask someone how they're feeling and they say, I'm blue. I'm not physically blue, that has a different meaning in this context. So a child who's deaf or hard of hearing might understand what the word blue is. They might be able to identify blue as a color. And when we talk about it as a state of being, it makes less sense. So having the ability to recognize the literal aspects of the language and communication they're learning, as well as those non literal aspects, can be important. And then inferencing. How do you make an inference that allows someone to understand, I know what you're talking about, whether you're actually saying that or not? Okay. So, a study that looked at school age deaf and hard of hearing children, now these children were mainstreamed in this study. That doesn't mean that this is true for all mainstream children or that it's not true for children who aren't mainstreamed, but this particular study focused on that population. When these scholars looked at the vulnerabilities and the strengths of children who are deaf or hard of hearing in school age, here's what they found. In terms of vulnerabilities, they found that children who are deaf or hard of hearing were more inclined to dominate conversations. When I've had opportunities clinically to interview adolescents and a little bit older who are deaf or hard of hearing and ask them about that experience, they've described to me the need to control a conversation so that they know where it's going. That if they're with a group of peers and the conversation is here and there and that they're not able to follow it, they're really at risk of being left out. So sometimes just kind of controlling the conversation helps someone to say, like, I know what's coming next. Children who are deaf or hard of hearing in this particular study showed a higher rate of non-contingent responses. So their friend might say something about the weekend, and then the child who's deaf or hard of hearing just continues talking about something that's happening at school. And the child who's in the conversation with them says, huh, okay. Depending on what their relationship is, that might just mean like, hey, I was talking about this. Oh, well, okay. And it brings them back. Or they might give up on that conversation, in which case the deaf or hard of hearing child might not be aware of why the conversation ended if they weren't really aware of them being non contingent with what their communication partner had said. Children who are deaf or hard of hearing show vulnerabilities in sequencing their stories. In this elementary school age, we do expect children to be able to have a story. Sometimes they are a little bit windy and curvy, but usually there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. And yet, children who are deaf or hard of hearing were more likely to miss out on some of those steps. And reduced use of reference, a reduced ability to be able to identify something that is shared knowledge, that is an object that they can look at, and be able to talk about that directly. It's also important, I think, for us to recognize that children who are deaf or hard of hearing can have pragmatic strengths. I don't want us to frame this as all children who are deaf or hard of hearing are going to have these difficulties. That's not true. And it's also not true that there are only vulnerabilities that we should attend to. There are many ways in which children who are deaf or hard of hearing might be good at scanning their environment, taking in additional information, being able to code switch between deaf and hearing cultures, for example. Those are all pragmatic strengths. In this particular study, Patch and Toe found that turn taking was a strength. Now, we've mentioned this can be an area of vulnerability, and that does seem to be true for younger children who are deaf or hard of hearing. As children are getting older, maybe they're growing in those skills to take turns. Children who are deaf or hard of hearing showed strengths in questioning, letting people know when they needed more information and seeking clarification. Those were combined to be able to say, I need more information here. Let me ask some questions so that I get the full picture. And also showing interests. And peers who are typically hearing found that to be a strength also of children who are deaf or hard of hearing, which is fantastic. In a study that looked at adolescents who are deaf or hard of hearing in schools, again, the study happened to be children who are mainstream, but we can take the lessons from it and see whether they might apply to the children that you support. In terms of pragmatic difficulties, Zaidman, Zait, and Most found that children who are deaf or hard of hearing had greater peer problems than their typically hearing peers. They also showed reduced prosocial behaviors. So those are areas of vulnerability, something for us to be mindful of and attentive toward. Pragmatic strengths were also noted, and I hope that we continue to emphasize those. that children who are deaf or hard of hearing showed greater social competence. Again, sometimes if you've been somebody who has been left out of conversations, you might be better at being able to ensure that when someone joins the conversation, they are being included. You might do something where you are used to not knowing exactly what's going on, so you develop strengths in being able to catch people up so that when they join you kind of summarize for them, we were talking about this and we got to the point of this part of the story, and then so and so was talking about what's next, and then you hand it back to them, so to speak. Those are strengths that deaf and hard of hearing children can portray. Increased perception of peer support is also a strength. So that was linked when people did have stronger pragmatic abilities. So they were ranked as having stronger pragmatic abilities. Then we saw increased perception of peer support. So suggesting that children who are doing well at developing these pragmatic abilities are seeing benefit with their peers and they're noticing that their peers are supporting them. Positive peer relationships have been linked with positive mental health. There's a robust literature that looks at the need for peer relationships and how that influences mental health. If we reflect back both at the initial slides where we had a picture of young children connecting and having peer relationships, and we talked about that being really an important part of what we want to foster. And if you think about your child that you had in mind, what would it mean for them to be successful? What would it mean for them to achieve their best? A lot of times we are thinking about those peer relationships and leading to having a robust and healthy life. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about assessing and measuring pragmatics. You might be wondering, okay, so if you've bought into the idea that this is important, well, how do we figure out more about it? So I'm going to talk about that next. First, I want to acknowledge that pragmatics can be tricky to measure. It's not like math ability, where you might give a test and figure out a child is able to do these competencies, and then there's a little gray area, and then there's stuff that they just can't do. And it can be relatively easy to assess some of those kinds of abilities. Pragmatics is not the same because pragmatics occurs across a wide variety of situations and circumstances and with a variety of communication partners. How it gets measured also varies depending on what aspect of communication and pragmatics you're interested in looking in. Commonly, pragmatics is measured using parent report. For children who are older, teacher report as well. Sometimes, although more labor intensive and time intensive, child to child observations can happen. So they can be observed and checklists at that time, or they can be video recorded and coded. Sometimes we're thinking about what are a child's known abilities. So a child in the past has demonstrated these things. We've seen the child ask a peer to join in a game. We've seen the child convey how to play a game to another child. So those are things that we've seen demonstrated over time. Other times, we know that a child has understanding of something. So a known ability, like, oh, they do have the skill to be able to ask to join, they just don't do it, versus a demonstrated skill. I saw them do it in a particular context. So that can influence what kind of support we might be looking to provide for a particular child, depending on whether we are teaching some base ability, like some base knowledge of these are things that you could do in social circumstances, or whether we're trying to see the extent to which a child is applying a skill that they have learned. This is a paper that assesses pragmatic skills using checklists. I was an author on this paper, and I'm just highlighting here a table that shows how we conceptualized the different kinds of pragmatic checklists. We didn't review them and then come up with one specific checklist that we endorsed because it really does depend on what aspects of communication and pragmatics a person is hoping to understand more about. So, this table might be something that you would find useful if you're interested in engaging in learning more about pragmatics and tracking pragmatic development in children that you are supporting. For example, this table talks about here are the age groups, this checklist is good for these age groups, and it's done by teacher report. Or another checklist is listed and it looks at a different age group and it might be parent support. So, this can be a guide just to help you to know what's out there in terms of the kinds of checklists that can be used for assessing pragmatics and to see what might fit your particular circumstances. The pragmatic checklist is a widely used tool in working with children who are deaf or hard of hearing. This particular one is found at the Success for Kids with Hearing Loss website. And this is the checklist that has been used to kind of track pragmatic abilities among probably the majority of studies that have looked at children who are deaf or hard of hearing in those early years. If you recall, I mentioned the work that was done by Goberis et al. And Yoshinagi Tano that really looked at how are children who are deaf or hard of hearing, how are their pragmatic abilities in those early years entering into elementary school versus children with typical hearing. And this was the checklist that they used. One of the strengths of this particular checklist is that it allows for respondents to rate children in a variety of ways. So, for example, it allows them to say they're not doing that, or they're doing it with a word or two, or a sign or two, or more complex language, 3 or 4 words, or really in robust language ways. So, this helps us to get at even for a child who has reduced overall language abilities, perhaps they're still demonstrating some of these pragmatic abilities. Or maybe this checklist can also say in a particular realm, such as regulating themselves, a child is using complex language to do that, but in terms of navigating some other social nuance, they're not using as complex language. This can give us information then about ways where we can bolster abilities amongst children and help us to think about the various ways in which pragmatics are necessary as children navigate their social worlds. This is freely available, and you can download it if you're interested. I want to end with a challenge for you. I would love for all of you who have watched and engaged in today's presentation to determine and implement a strategy for fostering pragmatics. Might you do that in your classroom? Perhaps you integrate that into each of the therapies that you're doing. Perhaps you have a caseload of children with a variety of abilities. And so maybe that involves thinking about what part of pragmatics do I want to work on? And can I help to infuse that across this wide variety of children? Maybe you are thinking about, oh, I really like what I learned about maybe inferencing or sarcasm. Maybe we want to spend some time learning about that and teaching about that, making it explicit so that children who are deaf or hard of hearing have the modeling and the exposure and the understanding available to them that these are skills that also really matter as they are building their communication abilities, having pragmatics be thought of and considered amongst the team, whether that's an educational team, a therapeutic team, or the family. How are we all helping to really build up these skills? We collectively have a shared interest in helping children who are deaf or hard of hearing to develop positive peer relationships. One strategy for doing that is through the development of pragmatics. So I'm going to challenge you, and I hope that you will accept that challenge to design and implement a strategy. How might you, move forward pragmatic development in the children that you serve? Thank you so much for joining me today.